Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. I'm Mukulika Banerjee in London, joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari, who is normally in New Delhi, but this week she is in London. So here we are, bringing you an episode to discuss really the status of the India-United States bilateral relationship, especially in light of Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Washington. What we thought we'd do today is look at specifics that came out of this visit on trade and tariffs, on immigration, but then also step back and take a slightly broader view of this relationship in an evolving global order, and maybe try and see in at least the midterm what this relationship could look like. To help us navigate this issue, we have with us two of the finest minds on this topic. Ambassador Navtej Sarna is a distinguished diplomat and has been India's ambassador to Israel and then to the United States during Prime Minister Modi's first term and indeed President Trump's first term, and he was there for those first 2 years of it. With him is Dr. Ashley Tellis, who is Tata Chair for Strategic Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace in Washington, D.C., and Ashley has been a key player in crafting this relationship over decades, including when the civil nuclear deal was being negotiated. So, gentlemen, let me start by asking you, I'm sure you've been following the events of Prime Minister Modi's visit. For you, as long-standing watchers of this relationship, what were you taking note of? What was of particular interest to you? Navtej?
Thank you, Mukulika and Pragya, and pleasure to be with Ashley once again. Well, it's been a very interesting visit. There was a lot to watch. Any time that you have President Trump on the screen, it means there's a lot to watch. And this time around, he's come in a particularly disruptive mood. And he's much, much better prepared than the first term, in the sense of well prepared to do what he wants to do. So therefore, I think the Prime Minister's visit came on the heels of some fairly dramatic, disruptive steps, which have already been taken in the first 3 weeks of this administration. So I think what everybody would have been watching for is what is India going to get? How is he going to behave with India? We, going to be able to continue. And I think this must have been in the minds of our delegation. Are we going to be able to pull off a continuity in the relationship which we have seen for more than 20 odd years? Give or take a thing or two. We knew there would be problems on trade. The problems on immigration had already started. So I think probably I, at least in my mind, had discounted those two areas that these, we will have to tackle. And they have been tackled to some extent, and they will be tackled, let us see with what success in the coming months. But I think I was watching whether we'd be able to pick up the strings on important stuff, lock in the gains of the Biden, Obama, and first Trump administrations on defense, on strategic convergence, on the beginnings of a technology cooperation, and on innovation and all the new stuff that we have been doing. So I think that's what I was watching. And on those counts, I think we have come out looking good. We have come out with a fairly successful notebook. And how much of that actually gets into play, how quickly it gets into play, that is something which, is a process-driven thing. But at least the intentions have all been carried forth, and there I see no disruption. And yes, there are those two areas and some others on which we can talk, but I'm sure Ashley would like to come in at this stage.
So thank you, Mukulika and Pragya. It's great to be with both of you and, of course, with Navtej, whom I've known for years. I broadly agree with everything that Navtej has said. But let me just step back for a second and just say a few words about the United States and where it is, right? Navtej emphasized that unlike the first Trump term, which was very improvisation, especially in the early months of President Trump coming into office, this time the president is very well prepared for what he is setting out to do. And whether you like his policies or not, you have to admit that there is a certain consistency to them. And he is certainly pushing an agenda that at least is very clear in his own mind. And if I were to summarize that agenda, I think he is making very clear to the United States and to the world that the US is now going to be first and foremost for itself. Now, all countries, to some degree, are for themselves. But I think he's making a special emphasis to underscore the point that the US is going to be solely for itself. And the measure of its success in the world is going to be how the world satisfies the United States. And that is a very different United States from the US that we've seen in years and decades gone by. Because while self-interest always rules, we thought preserving an orderly global system is part of our self-interest. And Trump is essentially saying now that an orderly global system is an optional accessory. And we will invest in it when we feel like it. We will invest in it to the degree that it satisfies our interests. But the measure of our policy will be ourselves. Now, this is a very different world that Prime Minister Modi has to deal with, even compared to the first Trump administration. And so my view is this visit, at least looking at it as an outsider, displayed three characteristics. First, I thought the Prime Minister made a remarkably astute attempt at flattering Trump and boosting his ego as a great leader. And because this is a very personalist administration of the kind that we haven't seen in a while, I think that was a tactically smart decision. You want to communicate to Trump that he is someone of substance and that he is important. And I think the Prime Minister did that both symbolically and in the very words that he used. Second, I think he went to great lengths to emphasize the point, at least rhetorically, that India will be a partner that is supportive of the United States. That India was not going to be in the league of naysayers and dissenters. And even if India privately feels chagrined by Trump's policies, I think there was a diplomatic astuteness with respect to obscuring those elements in favor of the emphasis on partnership. And the third element, which actually I found amazing, and which is why I think his visit was such a success, was that he managed to, at a time when Trump is consciously setting out to destroy all his predecessors' achievements, Prime Minister Modi actually managed to secure a fundamental perpetuation of Biden's policies towards India. In fact, if you read the joint statement, it's breathtaking that in almost every basket of the joint statement, what is there clearly and transparently is a continuation of Biden's policies towards India. There is a lot of repackaging because all administrations want to, take credit for doing something new. But what is really new is fundamentally in the repackaging. There are a few differences that are unique to this administration, but when you look at the broad sweep of the achievement, it's actually Biden 2.0 in US-India relations. And I say this because the Biden presidency was actually very successful from the point of view of building the bilateral relationship. And that Modi was actually able to persuade Trump to maintain broad continuity in the policy towards India, despite this new evolution of the US being for itself, I think is a remarkable achievement. And that is something that we should not overlook.
I want to unpack this in the context of trade, because perhaps that's the one thing that has been, of course, that's just one element of the bilateral agreement, but it is perhaps the one that has been getting the most attention because Trump came in and he began to almost indiscriminately impose and increase tariffs. And India was, of course, spared that first round, but preemptively India made moves towards lowering tariffs because Trump has previously called India tariff king. And as Prime Minister Modi was set to meet Trump, of course, we know that the US, introduced reciprocal tariffs right then and then. This is the context in which the US wants to be foremost for itself, like both of you identified. The US wants to correct trade deficits, particularly with India. It wants to corner countries, particularly India, into doing more purchases from the US, particularly the defense, security, oil and gas space, and take up the bilateral trade. It is in this context that this bilateral agreement is signed. I would want both of you to comment on how you read with who came away with what and what this really might mean for India, not just in terms of its relationship of trade with the US, but also in the sort of global trade scenario. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities for India in this context? Navtej, would you like to start, and then Ashley?
This is a film that we've seen before. This exactly happened in the first Trump term. He's got a bête noire, and that is a trade imbalance. That's the first thing that he hates. So if you're in the top 10 of countries who are, have a positive trade balance vis-a-vis the United States, you are going to be a target of his caustic remarks, of his public remarks, no matter how much he loves you. So that's one thing. The second thing is tariff has been weaponized. Tariff is a massive negotiating weapon with which he starts off. We saw it in the first term. We got the steel and aluminum tariffs, and after holding back for a long while, then finally we put reciprocal tariffs. We lost the generalized system of preferences because of our tariffs. We could not get even a mini deal on a few things, on market access, etc., going. Partly, honestly, our own fault, our own bureaucracy, and of course the very headstrong USTR team, which I must say there is basically a continuity in that too. So this part is not new. He's again started off with announcing tariffs on various countries and then giving temporary reprieve to some and carrying on with some. Now, we got reciprocal tariffs announced on everybody while the Prime Minister was there. So that would have easily rocked the board. And I must say, it's still out there. We don't know how reciprocal tariffs are going to be played out. They are a very complicated animal. And what they are not simply tariff for tariff. There are huge amounts of calculations that go into deciding how one country will respond. And as far as the immediate threat was concerned, we have used two things. One is we have bought time by managing an intention to finish the first tranche of the bilateral trade agreement. So we've kicked the can down 6 months. Let's see how successful that is. The second thing has been good old checkbook diplomacy. That I'm going to buy, we have a trade imbalance. Okay, we're going to buy more oil, and suddenly American oil is the best oil in the world. Natural gas is the best LNG in the world. And even the Foreign Secretary's press conference indicated that, we have got 15 billion and this could go up to 25 billion, which is 10 billion out of 35 billion imbalance. And this, I must say, this is exactly what we did in the first term. We were virtually buying no LNG and oil from America in 2017. We immediately started buying from Texas and Louisiana, etc. And that impacted. And the third element, which broadly goes unnoticed, but not by Mr. Trump, and that's there in the joint statement, to put out that Indian companies are investing in the United States, that Indian companies are creating jobs. Now, this was an exercise which was done in the first term. We got the CII to actually do a state-wise analysis of how many jobs was India creating in the United States. And then once we had the report, we would go and, throw it at several desks. But again, in this joint statement, you see a quantification of $7.25 billion or something like that, and 3,000 high-quality jobs, or 30,000, I forget the exact figure. But the fact that the figure is mentionable shows that it is for Mr. Trump to see that India is not only taking away things, it's also giving back to the United States, purely in terms of economy. Now, you asked for what is the broader impact on trade and all that. I think, yes, this is a time, in a sense, it's a good pretext that India has. We have to do an analysis. We have to do some soul searching on our tariffs. We are a very high tariff country. We are increasingly protectionist. And therefore, we are losing out on a lot of competition, For instance, the ASEAN countries have markedly low tariffs. And we have high tariffs in comparison. So if we want to do a China +1, if we want to import stuff, if we want, to build up an industry, which essentially you can't wish away globalization. So this is a good time. There is an argument for lowering our tariffs with or without Mr. Trump. But certainly now we have a timeline. And I believe that, if Mr. Trump comes for the Quad summit, I think one of the things that we'd like to present to him is this first tranche of the BTA.
So, it's very interesting that you bring this up, Navtej, that, tariffs in India have been a sort of, when it comes to economists, a sort of bipartisan issue. And there's some broad-ranging consensus that we have to lower our tariffs. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was the deputy chairperson of the planning commission under the former planning commission under the former regime, and a close personal friend of the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, have been saying this forever, that we should lower our tariffs by at least 50% if we want to be competitive, both at home and outside. And perhaps it will take Trump to do what India has not managed to do. But I can't help but wonder, so I will put this as an addendum to the question I've already asked you before Ashley answers, that is this the right way to go about reform? Because it feels a bit reactionary. I mean, if these reforms have been on the agenda for a while, there must be a reason why they haven't been pushed through. And one can't help but feel wary about hurriedly pushed through reforms, as we've seen earlier with taxation and so on. Ashley, your question.
So let me step back again just for a minute, because I think behind what is happening in the bilateral relationship on trade is a larger development that we must not lose sight of. First is Trump's approach to the question of trade bilaterally is emblematic of a larger attack on the global trading system itself, which he believes has ceased to serve America's interests. Now, there were two foundations on which that global trading system was erected. The first was the assumption that there would be differential expectations of developed versus developing countries where tariffs are concerned. That developing countries were permitted to maintain tariff barriers even as developed countries reduced their own tariffs. And this was to allow them to catch up. And that is the system that has basically evolved from GATT through the WTO.
Yeah.
What Trump is essentially saying now is that that differential treatment is unacceptable to the United States. In other words, your economic development status is irrelevant to the character of the trade policies that we are going to expect. The second element was most favored nation status. That is, the access that you give one country must be given to all countries. And what Trump is now basically saying through the whole mechanism of reciprocal tariffs, that depending on the deals he can get with individual countries, he will adjust market access to the United States for individual countries without necessarily universalizing that access. Now, these are two foundational elements of the global trading system, which he is basically saying the United States is going to walk out of. And he's not saying that we're going to walk out of as a matter of principle, right? But we are going to walk out of it as a matter of practice. And so that is essentially the backdrop against which one needs to assess U.S. trade policy in the months and in the next 4 years of the Trump presidency. Now, clearly, India has become vulnerable on this count because of his obsession that trade surpluses necessarily mean that U.S. interests are undercut. Now, it is truly hard to understand the logic of this argument because in Trump's worldview, I think he would like to have a trade surplus with every trading partner. Now, whether that can actually be sustained as a matter of global equilibrium, I mean, this becomes an, absurdity to the point of, incomprehension. But this is essentially what he seeks. Now, India can't fix the structural problems of global trade by itself, but it can move some distance in appeasing the direct threats that it faces from the United States. And this is where I agree with what Navtej said completely. It is in India's interest to revisit its tariff walls, not simply as a favor to us, though it's useful to use what it's going to do as a way of placating the United States in the interim, but essentially for its own economic success, right? Dealing with the challenges of competitiveness and so on and so forth. I think the problem in India arose pretty much in the COVID era and its aftermath, where the suppression of economic activity led to a shortfall of revenues. And the government, in its desire to plus up its revenues, essentially was looking for any mechanism. And tariffs essentially then started rising because they seemed like a very cool mechanism for raising government revenues. But there are huge costs to that policy. And I think India is now coming face to face with these costs. Now, I wish there was a better way to address these issues. And I must concede that, the unorthodox method that Trump has pursued to force India to sort of revisit this may, at the end of the day, turn out to be successful. In that he will force India through a bilateral process, at least to revisit the tariffs on the United States. This, of course, raises a bigger question, right? Which is, even if India satisfies the United States, and we will see whether we can get a trade deal in the next 6 months or whatever the timelines are, what this does to India's trade with other trading partners, and what this does to the United States vis-a-vis other trading partners. And at the end of the day, we have to remember that however vexatious India's tariffs are, India is not the biggest trade problem that the United States faces. We've got bigger trade problems by Trump's yardstick with our own neighbors. And, how we deal with the challenges of our trade within the hemisphere, the trade with China, these are all going to be big issues that we are going to be grappling with. And to me, if this entire sort of campaign ends up by creating even more chaos in the global trading system, I'm not quite sure how it advances, American interests, even in the very narrow sense, right? Because we must not forget that whatever our complaints about trade are, and there are some legitimate grounds for complaint, American welfare has certainly increased as a result of trade. I mean, we are much better off as consumers because of the global trading system. And to my mind, the big question actually, which is not yet answered because the effects of Trump's policies have not sort of cycled through our economy, is whether his attempts to solve America's trade problems by creating higher tariff walls, whether that will actually make life difficult for the social constituencies that are actually his political base. If this ends up raising the costs of commodities of people who can least afford them, and that is where his base is, right? It's essentially the blue-collar base, the blue-collar laboring base that essentially has voted him into power now in 2 elections. If they actually begin to find higher prices at the pump, higher prices of commodities in supermarkets, and so on and so forth, how does he persuade them that, this tariff strategy is in their interests? And so the consequences for American domestic politics, to my mind, are as intriguing as simply the economic costs of this policy. And on both these issues, we just have to stay tuned.
That's terrific, both of you. I mean, that puts so much more nuance to this tariff discussion, what you both just said.
If I may just
yes,
interrupt you, just a minor footnote to what we Ashley has said, and I tried to say earlier. The BTA is not going to be just about tariffs. There is the whole other issue of market access, and that is item specific. And that is going to be something, again, which is going to have to be worked out, We have our pet peeves on that, which is very difficult to move. And the United States has. For instance, access to the agriculture market of the United States is going to be a huge issue. And that, again, as Ashley referenced, that might be hitting certain quarters that support Trump. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting game to watch. For the moment, we may have trade off the front page, but it's not going away.
So as far as I can see so far, there are two broad things that are emerging from what you both said. One is that despite all the noise, there is remarkable continuity in the relationship between the US and India. Biden 2.0 policies is a strong thing to say, and it's interesting to read it like that, actually. And yet the disruptor-in-chief model that President Trump is associated with is certainly at work when it comes to trade and tariffs and this whole business of how to respond to globalization and its costs to the US domestic scenario, and so this interplay of domestic politics and foreign policy, which President Trump and Prime Minister Modi both have in equal measure. Foreign policy is dictated by domestic politics and vice versa, is really what we are going to see at every single stage going forward. So one aspect of this, which is key to this link between domestic and foreign, is, of course, the issue of immigration. That was another big sort of headline-grabbing story in the past few days and the first few weeks of Trump's presidency, was the returning of illegal immigrants to India. The US has sent back illegal immigrants before. This is not the first thing. But there was a certain spectacle that was created this time of sending immigrants back shackled and handcuffed, crammed in a military aircraft back to India. At the same time, there have been changes to citizenship, birthright citizenship now being ended. There is a normalizing, one could say, of racism. It was interesting, President Trump in the press conference openly saying, I cannot understand this man's accent because of the Indian accent. There's a certain sort of normalizing of the other, of the Indian in this. Given the strength of the Indian diaspora in the US, given the importance, as you were saying, Navtej, of the thousands of jobs that are created by Indians in the US, is this a real concern around immigration, or is this a lot of hot air? And how can and should India respond?
No, I certainly think immigration is a big concern. And on various counts, there's legal immigration and there's illegal immigration. So if you're just looking at legal immigration, I think the whole issue of H-1B visas, student visas, the birth policy, all that is going to impact a lot of people from India who study and work and try to get to America as the great shining city on the hill. And to some extent, it's a valuable contribution, not just to their personal careers and lives, but to the US economy. The fact is that the Indians have been taking a lion's share of the H-1B visas.
70%, yeah.
70%. But the point I'd like to underline here is that they are not all working for Indian firms. So the Indian firms take only about 20%, if I remember the figure right, of the H-1B visas. And that also, since this started last time Mr. Trump was in the White House, the Indian firms, the big Indian tech firms, have discounted this to a large extent. They are now relying more and more on US-based people rather than bothering to take a lot of people out here and worrying about H-1B and L-1B visas and so on and so forth. So ultimately, it helps the US big tech firms. And this is what happened again, if I go back to the last term, they started pushing. And again, so what happened previously is going to happen again. For the legal immigration, it's going to become more difficult. The rejection rates are going to increase. The bureaucracy around it is going to tighten. And that is happening, whether spouses can work, this, that. There are several aspects of the legal immigrant in the United States, and all that is going to get tighter, which is why you also see there's a people-to-people section in the joint communique, in which, the students are mentioned, because the students are contributing, according to that, something like $8 billion annually. So again, the figure is there for Mr. Trump to see and understand and reflect on. Here, there's money coming in here. There, in fact, the MAGA crowd itself is today divided on the H1.
Yeah.
You have the Musks and you have the Bannons and you have, so where this needle is going to stop, I think will take a lot of time to see. On the other hand, again, I think very much like tariffs, I have an unusual view of this. What is unusual? I say, do not waste political capital in fighting for H-1B visas. The Americans want H-1 Indian techies. And they're scoffed at. For instance, see Bernie Sanders' statements. They again, are we going back to the 90s and we're going to be called techie coolies? Because the allegation is that people are taking these migrants and giving at cheap salaries, which may not actually be true. I think there are certain standards which have to be met. So if the American firms don't work this system out in the favor of getting our people, ultimately the answer is again that is similar paradigm to the tariff argument. They create jobs here, use people here. I mean, we need those people as much as the United States needs them. And if we are talking of all this technology cooperation and, working in space and AI and, all these entire ICET thing, which is today called trust, we need those people here. So we have to also balance this. We all the time cannot simply go on pleading that please let my people in. So I think this is one. sorry if I've taken too much time, but on the illegal immigration, I just make a point. We all know that illegal immigration is wrong. And I think India has a very principled stand on this, that if it is proven that the person is Indian, we must take him back. But the fact is, the devil is in the details. It's not so easy to go through the entire legal processes. So I think by December, we knew that about 18,000 people have finished all legal recourse and are proven to be Indian, and they're going to be brought back.
18,000.
18,000, I think, was the figure that's been talked about. But an overall illegal immigrants population of Indians in the US is much, much bigger. It could be 10 times that bigger, 8 times that bigger. So the problem that came is with the perception of how they were brought. And whether that was intentional, whether that could have been modified or improved or ameliorated, and whether that will be so next time is, I think, where our diplomacy will again have to crank up. And we'll have to work on this. We'll have to work on making sure that we don't lose the perception battle, that we don't let this tail begin to wag the dog of the entire relationship.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of working with the ICE, working with the US authorities to see how these people are going to be sent back, how this is going to come out looking on television screens and, photographs and all that. And there, I think there is room for us to play and us to work on. So I think that's what we can't, if a person is Indian and he's illegal, he has to come back.
Sure. Actually, so much was made of the optics, as Navtej just noted, but it was mostly in India that people talked about the optics. Was there any talk of that in Washington, in the US at all?
I must confess not. In fact, the kind of optics that both of you referred to play very well with the president's base, because the assumption is these people should not have been here in the first place, and treating them in a way that they were is just desserts. And it is not an accident, as the old communists used to say, that the videos were actually made and disseminated, because that was part of the process of political mobilization for the president to show his constituency that he's being as tough as he promised. But there was a solution which I still find it strange that India did not pursue, which is the administration did offer India the opportunity to send its own aircraft and ferry these individuals back to India, essentially on Indian planes. And I don't understand why India did not take up that offer, because many of these problems would have disappeared if India had provided its own transportation, where it would have had full control over the process of essentially the transfer. But anyway, now the deed has been done. It's out there. It has caused all the angst, in my judgment, actually for the right reasons, because there are issues of human dignity here.
Yeah.
Irrespective of the status of the person. But I think one very concrete solution going forward is for India to essentially arrange its own transportation and minimize the discomforts of dislocation that are going to be inevitable, right? But let me say something about the bigger question again, if I may. I mean, there is a rift that is clearly opening up in the United States between people who think about immigration from an economic lens, using an economic perspective, and those who think about immigration using a cultural lens or from a cultural perspective. The people who think about it from an economic perspective understand clearly the benefits of immigration to the United States. And of course, they have on their side at least the popular mythology of the United States being a melting pot. that here is a country that accepts, willingly welcomes people from different countries because they essentially nourish American society and have made the American economy essentially what it is. And today, it's the high-tech industries that are the legatees of that view, who are basically saying, allow people from abroad to come because they increase our technological proficiency, our competitiveness, our profitability, and so on and so forth. And arrayed on the other side is also an equally old tradition, but which has been suppressed as a result of the success of American immigration in the last century. And that is a very nativist tradition. Thinks of the United States as essentially a white society and is deeply uncomfortable with the kind of cultural heterogeneity that we have seen in recent years. And the voices that are basically arguing for a suppression of immigration, legal and illegal, are essentially those who are harking back to a nativist vision of what the United States was. And you can't deny that this nativist vision was always present in American history since its founding. It's just that there were some moments when it surfaced and had prominence, and other moments when it was suppressed because of social movements or economic exigencies and so on and so forth. So there is, in that sense, a battle that is going on within the United States for America's soul about what kind of a country it actually is. And those who take their bearings from it being, that the best essence of America is that of the melting pot, are those who would be much more welcoming of immigrants. And it's those constituencies that are not absolving illegal immigration, but are in a sense more forgiving of first the fact that it's occurring and why it's occurring, and are looking for ways to mitigate the consequences of illegal immigration. But for those who are on the other side of the divide, the fact that it is occurring is a problem. The circumstances that are propelling its occurrence is irrelevant. And the solutions to that problem that they advocate are highly draconian. And my own sense prior to this election was that Trump actually was rooted in the nativist tradition. But because of the peculiar alliance that has now arisen between the high-tech constituencies in the United States and this president, those nativist sentiments seem to have taken a backseat. And now the big question is whether this sort of peace pact between the president and high-tech will survive. If it survives, then I think it buys us some time and space to come up with a strategic approach to dealing with the issues of immigration. If this peace pact collapses, then I'm afraid we will get back to a much more, contentious approach to dealing with immigration. And as of today, I don't know which side will win. For the moment, the people who think about this economically are in the ascendancy. I also want to point before I exit, and I just want to sort of underscore the point that Navtej made, because to my mind, that is the long-term solution, even with respect to some forms of legal immigration. And that this pertains directly to the H-1B question, right? I think the long-term solution for the H-1B problem is twofold. One is for the United States to invest in global capability centers in India so that you have skilled Indian professionals working in India for global firms, and that benefits both India and the global economy. And two, to the degree that we have an H-1B category, I think it will increasingly have to be defined by a certain minimal wage standard, because that's the only way you avoid abuses. And you basically say, if these people are so valuable coming in, then they must be paid a certain minimum to guarantee that they have comparative advantage relative to American citizens. And that minimum wage has to be set relatively high. so that you just simply can't import labor from all over the world, in the way that it's currently done now. And I don't know what the administration's thinking on H-1B is right now beyond sort of the headlines. But eventually, I think if the program survives, it will go in that direction. And it should.
So, we've been talking about domestic perceptions. Ashley, you brought it up in the context of tariffs and what happens if Modi's voter base starts to feel the impact of these increased tariffs. And then, of course, we were talking about the visuals of illegal immigrants coming back to India in shackles and so on. And that can't possibly have done well for the brand of Modi as a strongman, even if there is a perfectly nuanced explanation to what happened and why it happened, and how, contemporaneously this may have played very well for Trump. The extradition of Bahadur Rana, on the other hand, is bound to play very well for Mr. Modi. The question I wanted to kind of get to, because both of you have had, ringside, if not in the ring, views on how these negotiations really go on. And I wonder what you have to say about this kind of friction between domestic politics and effective foreign policy. Navtej, would you like to start?
Well, Pragya, I think it's a sort of given that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, not directly, but certainly as an instrument which serves your domestic goals. And there are domestic constraints, and they depend upon situation to situation. For instance, when you're dealing with our neighbors, your domestic politics and state politics becomes something which comes directly into play. For instance, Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, West Bengal and Bangladesh, or UP, Bihar and Nepal. So there you can see it greater. But here, clearly, why are we going all the way, placating Mr. Trump, working out a plan for the future, is not simply, an act of foreign policy, because you're working towards actualizing the entire potential of your own people. If you're wanting to improve the entire development base, whether it is through trade or through it is artificial intelligence or technology. And this distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy is valid to a point, but they are both very deeply linked. For instance, you mentioned the perceptions of the immigration today. Today on television, there is now a battle going on between the states. Why is the aeroplane landing here and why is it not landing there? So, so it's very difficult in today's world to see foreign policy as some esoteric thing done by, diplomats sitting in some smoke-filled rooms and sorting out stuff. That doesn't happen any longer. It's done in public view. It's all over social media. And again, so the relationship is very immediate. So ultimately, foreign policy is not abstract. Foreign policy has to serve your ends, nation's ends. And by definition, they become domestic, whether they are security ends, they are economic ends, they are social ends, they are health ends, they are educational ends. So all that is related. So I really don't know where to draw this line, honestly.
So, I came into government essentially as a failed academic because I used to think about international politics in a way that, realist theories of politics would suggest the world works, right? And the assumption in most realist theories were that states are essentially black boxes. There is something called an objective national interest which they pursue. And that objective national interest can be understood irrespective of what happens inside the box. And when I came to Delhi, working for Bob Blackwell at the embassy, one of the first lessons I learned was that you can have the grandest foreign policy design, but if it doesn't pass muster with a domestic base, the chances of that design succeeding in the world outside are virtually zero. And and particularly in democratic societies, though that's equally true, actually, in authoritarian societies, right? There is a umbilical connection between domestic politics and foreign policy. And we don't quite understand the mechanics of that very well, at least at a sort of abstract conceptual level. But in practice, I mean, that is true every time. That is true every time. And you can see it in the world that we see today. You can see it in this visit, where so many of the initiatives that were signed on to by Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have roots. The objectives are to satisfy certain constituencies on both sides. And so I see this as being an increasingly important element in our relations going forward. There is just simply no way to escape the chokehold of domestic politics. And you can certainly, I mean, I can't speak for India, but I can speak with a little more comfort for the United States. And you can see every policy that Trump is pushing forward on is aimed at satisfying an interest of the United States, but an interest that is defined in terms of the well-being of certain groups that have supported the president.
You know, while we're talking about public discourse, I wanted to ask another question, which is that, you know, both there's this sort of perception that Modi and Trump are natural allies. They are ideologically aligned, they are politically aligned, they are both strong men in the era of strong men. But I wonder how much of this discourse really matters in terms of actually how the bilateral relationship progresses. I wonder if there are gulfs behind that are not as easy to simply fill because there's a sort of bonhomie between like-minded personalities. Navtej, would you like to comment on it?
This is an old conundrum, Pragya. How much does personal chemistry, even if it exists, how much of it is real? And how much of it is projected? And thereafter, how much does it actually play a part in actual diplomacy? I think Prime Minister Modi has now dealt with every American president since President Obama. And with everybody you felt, oh, they have a great personal chemistry. So I think you have to be careful. This is the art of leadership, that, you are dealing with a person who's very important to you and objectively very important. You have to make him feel that he's the most important person in the room and in the country and in possibly the world. So I think this personal chemistry, can't be defined. Both of them have come through elections. Both of them have had, sort of not something that have they come and taken autocratic rule by force, and they are strong men in the sense that you talk of strong men of yore. So they are democratic leaders, So ultimately, yes, I think that is the art of leadership, how quickly you establish a personal rapport with your counterpart. And I must say that they have done it very, very well right from day one, from I think it was the 17th of June, 2017 or the 16th of June when they met for the first time and instantly had a great day-long a meeting in which Trump was entirely on message. He did not disrupt a single sentence. And this time, it's a question of building up. Now, how much does that play into a real diplomacy? Well, if it doesn't exist, then things don't move. But it freezes up things. If, for instance, he had a terrible visit with Angela Merkel, I recall, where he supposedly refused to shake her hand. That puts the relationship in a deep freeze. You go back to Cold War sort of syndrome. But if it exists, it helps. But I don't think it can help simply that I like you, love your jokes, I love the way you dress, so I will not put tariffs on you. That doesn't happen. So there's a limit to where personal charisma and personal rapport works. After that, it's nuts, bolts, a lot of hard work, a lot of hard negotiations, interministerial, or in the United States, the entire intergovernment, coming together, dealing with the parliaments, all sorts of other things come in. So that one is a good icebreaker, let me say. And if it doesn't exist, then it's pure ice.
Shay, any thoughts on that?
I think Navtej summarized it perfectly. I mean, I think of these personal relationships as being lubricants, but the lubricants are not substitute for momentum which derives from your interests as mediated through the constituencies that you have to satisfy. And so all things being equal, you would want to have a good personal relationship with your opposite number. But there have been instances where leaders have held their nose and dealt with their opposite numbers because of the compulsion of circumstances. A classic example is the US management of its relationship with the Soviet Union during the Second World War. I mean, shall we say Joseph Stalin was not FDR's, favorite strategic partner. But the compulsions were so intense at that moment that you simply overlook all the pathologies of chemistry and get the job done. I would say the more you depend on your partners, the quality of the relationship you have with them matters in an objective sense. What worries me about the United States at this moment is that we tend to have an attitude that, one, we don't need partners. And to the degree that there are partners implicated, they need us more than we need them, and therefore can ride roughshod over them. I mean, if that is our appreciation of, the relationships that we enjoy with our best friends and allies, then I think, no matter how good personal chemistry may be, you will still end up with very scratchy bilateral relationships. Now, I hope I'm proved wrong in this, but at the end of the day, you cannot quite forget that there are interests mediated through your political base that are extremely important in all these relations. And that, I think, Navtej put it well. It's the nuts and bolts at the end which will deliver, not the chemistry.
Part of the challenge, I suppose, is that the immediate commentary on these visits is rarely about the nuts and bolts. It is about the number of hugs and who flattered whom and what was said. And that, when you're playing a perception war in domestic audiences, in fact, a lot of the attention is focused and remains focused on that. And that's why the follow-up to actually what came out of it, of this deal, how long is it going to take to materialize? Is there going to be knowledge transfer in tech, for instance, which has been a sticking point between the US and India? Is that needle going to ever shift? Is ultimately the question. But public opinion rarely sort of stays on these issues long enough to look at it. And that, therefore, perception becomes very important. And the one thing that both Trump and Modi have in common is that they do care about that perception, perhaps even more than other global leaders have in the past. This is, what you're saying obviously is generically true, but we do have two men here who, on the one hand, care about perceptions and what people say about them. They have fragile egos that can be flattered, and therefore, you can get quick wins. But there is also a less personality-driven thing, but a more ideological commitment, should we say, to disruption of existing norms, right? So they are both now existing in their second and third terms in a very different global order than they were in the past. They are personally responsible for some of this. I mean, India has been very clear that its diplomacy is not, it has roots in non-alignment in the long ago past, but now it's much more interest-led. There are a series of bilateral relationships that will be negotiated rather than long-standing alliances. The US is tearing up the relationship at the moment since Modi's visit. The US-Europe relationship is in question and being questioned as we speak. So this is a very different set of circumstances. It's not business as usual. It's not how diplomacy has worked in the past. You have explosive personalities and a rules-based order that is being torn up and thrown out of the window and we don't know what is going to replace it. So as I think as we wrap this up and look a little bit into the sort of medium term, long term is out of the question, but even in the medium term, given your experience of watching this relationship over such a long period of time, is there anything you can say for certain anymore about what the contours will be determined by or what they indeed will be? Or is this totally, time will tell? Ashley, what do you think?
Well, I think the obvious insight from watching the last few months is to suggest that US-India relations will become more transactional, even if they are not packaged as such. In fact, I think both sides will bend backwards to emphasize strategic convergence, to focus on the things that bind us. But beneath that lofty scaffolding, I think there is going to be a transactionalism that simply cannot and will not be avoided. That is certainly true at the US end. I mean, we will say all the right things because we value India as a partner. It is still an uncertain world out there, and we want India on side rather than off side. But in our bilateral negotiations with India, I think there will be very clear objectives that this administration will pursue, and perhaps in a much more hard-nosed way than its predecessors did, and even than it itself did in the first term. I think that sort of, the centrality of transactionalism is going to be a sort of very striking motif of this relationship, at least in the foreseeable future. Whether that is acknowledged by both sides in their public framing or not, I just don't see it any other way. I just don't see it evolving any other way.
Yeah. Navtej, do you agree, or do you have a slightly different reading of it?
I think there's no question about it. It is going to be a transactional relationship, and not only from the American side. I think our own foreign policy has taken a turn towards the realpolitik, towards the pragmatic, and it is essentially a response in many ways to a completely world without a center, or a world whose center is an explosive center, rather than something that brings together things. So at the moment in the world, it seems every man for himself.
Yeah.
And I think in that situation, India is probably correct and probably, doing the things that, okay, let's get what we can from here, from the US, let's carry on, and let's adjust for Trump. We are adjust for Trump and taking whatever we can for our purposes. Now, only thing is that this is not the only relationship in the world.
Yeah.
There are other major players, there's Russia, there's China. And again, that a lot of the diplomatic space that we get to maneuver will depend a lot on what happens with those relationships with the United States. I mean, if the United States-Russia relationship improves, I mean, it's conventional that's good for us because, there's less cracking down on us for dealing with Russia, etc. Now, you're going to sanction Russian ships, which is going to impact our oil. But if that doesn't happen, then it's easier for us to move in that space. It depends upon, I think the big question mark is what will the Americans do with China? And my fear is that if there is a deal at some stage, can we then still continue to bank on the United States to deliver everything that we have put into the joint statement? Or will somebody lose focus on this? Because at the moment, the China factor is a strong anchor for our strategic convergence. You see it reflected in the Quad in fairly strong language. And, it's so all that is there. So there are many question marks. So I think at the moment it is to work with whoever you can, as much as you can, until somebody says, no, you can't.
Actually, because you're right there in DC, you've been, you work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There are so many think tanks and knowledge about India that's been developed for decades. I'm just curious, how far up on the priority list of countries and interests is India at the moment in the US? Are people curious about it? Is it important for the White House administration, for the State Department? Where is it on the list of priorities? Or is it outranked as with others by China and Russia, the Middle East?
I think it really depends on the exigencies of the moment. I mean, everyone understands abstractly that India is an important country for the United States. But, that is always translated through the medium of what the challenges of the moment are. As Navtej said earlier, right, the U.S. relations with China, U.S. relations with Russia, U.S. relations with Europe will really provide a defining framework within which the relationship with India will find opportunities or constraints. And so it's easy to answer at the abstract level that among developing countries, India is among the most important. You can't forget it. If you want to protect a balance of power in Asia that serves American interests, India is extremely important, and so on and so forth. But these are all abstractions. At the end of the day, it depends on what you're concretely doing at any given moment. So, for example, if President Trump believes that there is an opportunity now to create a settlement with China on a range of issues, involving trade, involving geopolitics, involving the future of Taiwan, and the U.S. moves in substantial measure towards that approachment, then there will be implications for India and our relationship for India and India's relationship with us. And so my sense is, just wait and watch how our relations with other key players evolve. And that will define the space within which the US-India relationship will move. So it's less a problem in my mind about whether there is a reservoir of knowledge about India or not. I mean, yes, the degree that that reservoir exists, it's good for the United States. But the policy towards India will not be shaped by the presence or the absence of knowledge. It will be defined by the opportunities and constraints that arise from our relationship with other actors. And the most important of which, in my view, is China, followed closely by Russia. And the moment you say Russia, it implicates Europe. So, and of course, when you say China, it implicates Japan, it implicates others in Asia as well.
Two very quick questions, follow-up questions rather, before we close. The first for you, Navtej. You were talking about how we are moving towards, moving away from the kind of foreign policy which has been our legacy, rooted in the non-aligned movement, towards a more transactional approach to dealing with countries. What I want to understand here, Navtej, is there a strategy, is there a philosophy to the way in which our foreign policy is evolving, or is it just responsiveness and improvisation at large?
No, I think what I meant was not that, you've moved completely away from the principles of non-alignment, because we do talk a lot about strategic autonomy. Sometimes that strategic autonomy comes through as purely transactional. You say that I'm buying oil from Russia because it's useful for me at this stage and I'm getting it cheap, so I'm doing it. At the same time, we say that we will do what is in our interest, and that in a way, nobody goes around saying my foreign policy is transactional, because foreign policy has to have a window dressing of value, and even strategic autonomy is a value. So I think that is as what it is being it is being projected. Maybe it is the right response to a world of rivalries and contradictions and and every man for himself. The only thing I wanted to add was that, India should also, and I'm sure our policymakers think of this because we've had the Global South Summit, for instance. There are larger concerns which are beyond us, but ultimately work on us. And we are part of another set of countries also. So, we have to think in terms of not purely working the India-US relationship or not purely getting what we can from Russia at whatever cost we can. But I think the ultimate value of India is the value, and that is where, we have to keep on going back to that are we a leader of the Global South? Are we going to take care of certain concerns which are there? For instance, climate change has been completely lost, including during the visit. I don't think I saw something, perhaps I missed something there. Ashley probably read it more closely. But
no, I'll tell you what you may have missed is Mr. Trump reiterated how America had the cleanest energy, and that is what was going to be exported to India.
But he's also talking of, you saw what Mike Waltz issued, some drill, baby, drill, buy, baby, buy, So, there is a return to the fossil fuel culture with great vigor. And, we have to think of, and that's again a gap in the world, which no country is filling today. And that is something also which is India's role can be there. People say, what is India going to do in the Middle East? What is India going to do there? You will be able to do things once you have accrued that weight also beyond economic weight. So
perhaps our potential as Vishwaguru is yet to be realized.
I think the idea is that we should, even with Mr. Trump, we should, once in a while talk climate change.
No, that makes complete sense. Actually, my last question to you is, a couple of months ago, we did an episode on the U.S. indictment against Gautam Adani. And we spoke with Jerry Roth, who's the former prosecutor from the New York Eastern District Court. And he was talking to us about the seriousness of the DOJ charges and we asked him that, do you think these charges might go away when President Trump comes to power? And he said he'd be very surprised if that happens. Of course, as we all know, President Trump has stayed all of DOJ's activities with regards to foreign corrupt practices. And of course, the SEC charges still stay, but, and I think to me, this was interesting because this is a fairly recent episode and, 2 months down the line, it doesn't stand. I know you started this conversation by saying that there is a consistency this time around, there is a sort of robustness this time around to Trump 2.0. But I can't help but wonder if this is going to last. Trump projects himself as an agent of chaos, but is he not actually an agent of chaos? Could he start, drinking his own Kool-Aid in this regard? And if that is what is to be, what worth are discussions like this? How do you see your role as an analyst who essentially works on knowledge banks that draw from past experience?
See, well, it certainly makes life difficult and interesting simultaneously, right? I mean, when we talk about consistency, we have not asked consistency to what ends. Part of the consistency that he's demonstrated in the last few weeks is focused on dismantling what he considers to be the structures of the deep state. Yeah. And so the conclusions that were drawn in your last conversation about the Adani case presumed essentially a structure of governance where even the most ambitious and powerful chief executive would not interfere with criminal processes that the Department of Justice would pursue. There was always an autonomy that the Department of Justice had from the executive, from the chief executive. And that goes back to developments in U.S. history after Watergate. But we have seen, for example, in the case of Eric Adams, the New York mayor, where the Department of Justice from the very top has actually instructed the U.S. attorney to drop the charges. And we can speculate as to why that happened, but it is calling into question that big assumption that the Department of Justice has an autonomy to prosecute, its cases with the freedom that it traditionally enjoyed. And if you think of the Department of Justice as being now part of the deep state that, President Trump wants to dismantle, then everything that has happened with respect to Eric Adams is very consistent with the policies that he has pursued since he has come into office. So it's not just consistency as a sort of kind of action, but the actions to which, his goals are directed. And so I think we are going to see behaviors that we have simply not seen in the US for a long time to come. And it is going to create, and this is for me the worry, it is going to create opportunities for private actors to essentially manipulate the system to their private advantage. In any democratic society, private actors can access the government and will attempt to use the government for private advantage. But if it is done in a blatant sort of way, as threatens to be the case now and going forward, then it raises questions about, what is the meaning of popular will? What is the meaning of sovereignty? All the kinds of things that political scientists sort of scratch their heads about, right? But there are practical consequences to these issues, and I suspect we are going to see those practical consequences in the months ahead.
Thank you both. I think that's a grim note to end with, but it is true. This whole legal question raises the sort of larger question at the heart of any democratic project, which is separation of powers. That has been one of those cardinal principles. At least there's a nodding acknowledgement of and some protection of that separation of powers between the different forms of between the legislature and the executive, and that's disappearing. So thank you both very much. This is a difficult and complex landscape to make sense of. You've both been absolutely terrific in helping us understand this, not just the screaming headlines, of which we've had a lot, but a rather sober, sane, informed, nuanced discussion. Thank you all for listening. This is goodbye from all of us here in the different corners of the globe coming together for this episode of the India Briefing. Pragya is in London. She won't be in London for our next recording, but she will be back in Delhi. I will be in London, and we will come back to you very soon with another episode. In the meanwhile, do write to us. Let us know if you'd like us to do an episode on anything that is of particular interest at kib.uljo.in. So now, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.